The first thing I noticed was that Zoe wasn't knocking. She was standing at the glass double doors of the banquet hall, palms flat against the surface, watching the party from outside. Inside, the birthday cake being carried out, her grandfather turning 60, a room full of people she'd known her entire life. She could see all of it. She just couldn't get in. The door was locked. She hadn't knocked because she was 8 years old, and she understood, on some level I hadn't yet processed, that knocking wasn't the point. I stood there for a moment looking at her before I moved to let her in. I don't know why I paused. Maybe I was trying to remember when exactly I had decided that this family was difficult but manageable, that things would get better with time, that I was probably reading into things. 6 weeks later, I had a USB drive in my purse and a conversation with my father that ended one version of my family. And I still don't have a clean word for what it started. I want to say I was blindsided, that the night of my father's birthday party was the night everything changed and I had no way of seeing it coming. But that's not honest. What changed that night was that I stopped pretending I hadn't noticed. Those are different things. One is a story about a woman who was shocked by her family. The other is a story about a woman who had been making excuses for them for 8 years and finally ran out. I've been trying to figure out which story to tell, and I keep landing on the same answer. They're the same story. The shock and the history are the same event, just the moment where they became impossible to separate. So I'm going to tell you both. I'm going to tell you about the 8 years before the locked door. The way I explained things away, the things I chose not to see, the version of my family I preferred. And I'm going to tell you what a security camera recorded in 47 seconds that made that version impossible to keep. And then I'm going to tell you what my father did with it, because that part I didn't see coming. Zoe was born when I was 27. Her father, Marcus, and I had been together 3 years, and were not built for the long term. We both knew it before the end, and we ended it without destruction. He lives 40 minutes north of me. He has Zoe every other weekend, every other holiday, and 2 weeks in August. He's a good father in the specific way that matters. He shows up, and when he shows up, he's present. My family had a complicated relationship with Marcus's existence. Not complicated in any way they would ever name out loud. That's what I need you to understand first, before anything else. Nobody in my family ever said anything explicitly racist to me or in front of me. There was no slur, no scene, no moment I could point to and say, there, that's when it started. What there was instead was a long, slow accumulation of small things that I kept deciding didn't add up to what they added up to. The Christmas when Zoe was 4, my sister Karen gave her nephew a remote control car, the specific model he'd mentioned wanting 3 weeks earlier in passing at dinner. She gave Zoe a craft kit, the kind with foam stickers and glitter glue still in its shrink wrap. Generic. Off the front display at the drugstore. I told myself Karen didn't know Zoe as well, that it would come with time. I said thank you. Zoe said thank you. Karen smiled and moved on. When Zoe was 5, my mother updated the photo wall in the living room. She added my cousin's new baby, a school portrait of Karen's son, a school portrait of Karen's daughter. She updated the Thanksgiving family shot. Zoe was in it, standing in the back row between me and my father, holding a paper turkey she'd made at school. But on the wall where the individual frames went up, each grandchild with their own photo, their name and a little wooden block underneath, there was no frame for Zoe. I pointed it out once carefully, choosing my words. My mother said she just hadn't gotten around to ordering one. She'd do it soon. 2 years later, the wall was reorganized and repainted. Still no Zoe. I told myself she'd get to it. I told myself my mother was from a different generation. I told myself I was being sensitive. I put it in the box with all the other things and kept carrying it. My mother occasionally mentioned Zoe's hair, the texture of it, the products it needed, the way you had to handle it differently. She said these things with the tone of someone offering practical help. She never acknowledged what she was really doing, which was treating her granddaughter's hair as evidence of a problem. My father, Jim, was warmer, or seemed to be. He'd ask about school at family dinners. He'd let Zoe sit next to him and he'd answer her questions. She'd figured out early that he liked baseball and she'd started asking about it. Who was winning? What team was good this year? Because she wanted a way in with him, a real one. He'd answer her. He was patient about it. He seemed to enjoy it. But in 8 years, he had never sought her out. He'd never called to ask about her specifically. Not on her birthday, not after her school plays, not after I told my mother she'd made the honor roll in 2nd grade. He took Karen's son to the hardware store on Saturdays sometimes, and Karen's daughter to the diner. Small things, easy things. He never did those things with Zoe. I noticed. I put it in the box. The box was very heavy by then, but I was very practiced at carrying it. The thing about Zoe is that she noticed too. I know this because of the questions she stopped asking. When she was 5 and 6, she would ask why she wasn't in Grandma's photo wall. She'd ask why Grandpa never called her the way he called Karen's kids. She'd ask me directly, "Does Grandpa like me?" I'd give her soft answers. "Grandpa loves you, he just shows it differently. Some people are quieter." I'd hold her and change the subject and hope she'd move on. Around 7, she stopped asking. Not because she'd gotten the answer, because she'd understood that asking didn't change anything. She started managing herself at family events. She'd help with things unprompted, carrying plates, picking up napkins, asking my aunt if she needed anything. And I understood she was making herself useful because she'd figured out that being useful was safer than being visible. She stayed close to me when she was uncertain. She found the adults she could talk to and worked them carefully. She was 8 years old and she was already very good at this. I was her mother and I had let it go on long enough for her to get good at it. There's no way to say that that doesn't hurt, so I'm just going to say it and keep going. The party was for my father's 60th. Karen had organized everything. Rented a banquet hall downtown, 40 people, a caterer, a photographer hired to spend the evening taking candid shots. Zoe picked out a blue dress with small yellow flowers at the collar. She was excited on the drive over. She asked if we'd get there before the cake so she could help carry it in. I said we'd see. She asked if she'd get to sit next to Grandpa. I said probably. She pressed her face against the car window and watched the street lights and didn't ask anything else. The party was crowded in the way rented venues become crowded. Everyone trying to be festive, everyone a little louder than necessary, the energy of people who don't all know each other making an effort. I knew most of them. My parents' neighbors, church friends, some relatives from my father's side I recognized but couldn't name. Zoe stayed near me for the first hour. She ate at a table with my cousin's kids and was polite and quiet. She helped me carry the card box to the gift table when I asked. She found my father at one point and said happy birthday, and he said thank you, and squeezed her shoulder, and she came back to me with the look I'd learned to recognize, trying to decide if that counted. Around 8 o'clock, the caterers brought out the birthday cake, and the room reorganized around my father. I got pulled into a conversation with my uncle near the bar. He was asking about my job, the school year, the kind of questions people ask at parties when they want to seem engaged but don't need real answers. I was half listening and half watching the room. I talked to him for maybe 20 minutes. When I looked around for Zoe, she wasn't there. I checked the tables, the gift area, the corridor toward the bathrooms. I moved through the room once and didn't find her. I found Karen near the dessert table and asked if she'd seen Zoe. Karen said she thought Zoe had stepped outside to the courtyard for some air and the door had swung closed behind her. Something about the way she said it. Not worried, not even particularly interested. The way you'd mention something neutral. The weather, the parking, something with no stakes. I walked to the glass double doors at the back of the room, floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out onto a small courtyard with potted plants and bistro lights strung between 2 poles. From outside, you needed a key or someone to push the bar from inside. Zoe was standing on the other side, palms flat against the glass, watching. She'd been watching the party from outside. I pushed the bar and opened the door, and she walked through without making a scene. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything accusatory. She said, "I didn't want to bother anyone." She was 8 years old and she had been standing outside her grandfather's birthday party and she didn't want to bother anyone. I looked at Karen. Karen was already turned towards someone else. A conversation I'd apparently interrupted by walking over, now resumed. But in the half-second before she turned, I saw her face. There was no surprise in it. She'd been waiting for this moment, had her expression ready on the other side of it. She wasn't surprised I'd found Zoe. I noted that and filed it and kept my face where it needed to be. My father was about to blow out his candles. I brought Zoe to the table, stood beside her, helped lead the singing. She sang along. She clapped. She is better at managing her face than most adults I know. On the drive home, she asked if she could have the leftover piece of cake she'd wrapped in a napkin. I said yes. She ate it in the back seat and looked out the window and didn't say anything about the door. Neither did I. After she was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and thought about the door for a long time. I ran through Karen's explanation. Zoe stepped outside. The door swung closed. Accident. The door had a push bar on the inside and a key lock on the outside. For it to be locked, someone had to engage the mechanism from inside. It didn't swing closed and lock itself. That's not how those doors work. I wasn't certain Karen had done it on purpose. I was certain Karen's explanation didn't fit the door. I called her the next morning and kept it simple. The courtyard door was locked from the inside. Zoe couldn't get back in. I don't know how it got locked. It must have caught somehow. Karen, it doesn't catch. It has a deadbolt lever. I really don't know. I thought she'd gone out for some air and I didn't think much of it. I'm sorry she was out there. She said it the way people say sorry when they mean, this conversation is over now. You saw her through the glass. I thought she was fine. Kids stand at doors like that. She had her hands on the glass. Rachel, I had 40 people to manage. I wasn't watching Zoe every second. That's your job. I got off the phone before I said something I couldn't unsay. I sat there for a few minutes. Then I called my mother. I kept it even simpler. The courtyard door was locked. Karen saw Zoe outside and didn't open it. My mother's voice shifted into that particular register, the one she uses when she's already decided how the conversation ends. I think you're reading a lot into this. Karen was managing the whole event. Nobody did anything wrong. Zoe was fine. She was alone in a locked courtyard while the party went on without her. She was outside for a few minutes, Rachel. It wasn't a few minutes, and she didn't go out there on her own. A silence. Then my mother said, smoothly, as if the previous topic had been resolved, "Your father is working on some estate planning. There are things we should sit down and discuss when you're ready to have a calm conversation." I felt the shift like a door of its own. She had moved from the locked courtyard to the will in one breath. Not accidentally. She had put those two things in the same sentence because they belonged there, because in her mind they were part of the same project, and she'd decided I already knew that. I said, "What does the estate have to do with last night?" She said, "I think you know the answer to that, Rachel." And then she was ready to wrap up the call. I sat with that sentence for 3 days. I think you know the answer to that, meaning she believed I'd already understood what was happening, that the door and the will weren't separate incidents. They were the same intention, moving forward on different tracks. She wasn't wrong. That was the part I kept circling. She wasn't wrong. I had known something was wrong for years. I just hadn't admitted that something had a shape. On the 4th day after the party, I took Zoe to the park with the creek behind it. She'd brought the binoculars Marcus had given her for her birthday. She liked using them on clouds. She'd lie in the grass and narrate what she saw, turning them slowly across the sky. She found a shape she said looked like a sleeping dog. She found one she said looked like a hand. She found one she said just looked like a cloud. I asked her how she decided which ones looked like something and which ones were just clouds. She thought about it. She said, "If it makes you think of something right away, that's what it is. If you have to really try, it's just a cloud." I remembered that for a long time after. That evening, my father called. He was warm in the careful way that means warmth is doing a job. He said he'd had a wonderful birthday. He asked how Zoe was. He asked if she'd had a good time at the party. I said she'd had a fine time. He said, good. I asked, Dad, what's this estate planning Mom mentioned? A pause, short but deliberate. He said, there's nothing to worry about right now. Just routine organizing, making sure things are in order. She made it sound connected to Zoe. Rachel, it's not something we need to go into over the phone. I said, okay. He said, give Zoe a hug from me. I said I would. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table and understood that he had not denied the connection. He'd said it wasn't a phone conversation. Those are different statements, and he was careful enough to know that, and I was tired enough of giving him credit for things he hadn't earned to pretend otherwise. Karen texted me a week later. The message said, Rachel, I know last week was tense. I think sometimes things happen and we read more into them than is really there. I hope you and Zoe are doing well. No apology. The architecture of an apology with nothing inside it. I put my phone down and didn't respond. 3 weeks after the party, I was making coffee and Zoe was at the kitchen table eating cereal before school. She was looking at her spoon. Out of nowhere, she said, Mom, does Grandpa like me? I turned around from the counter. She was still looking at her spoon. I said, of course he does. She looked up at me for a moment. Then she looked back at her spoon. She said, okay. Not convinced, not upset, just done asking. I put her on the bus and came back inside and stood in the kitchen and understood that I was out of time for deciding what to do about any of this. I drove to my parents' house on a Tuesday afternoon without calling first. I needed to see their faces. My father's car was in the driveway. I knocked, and my mother answered in the voice she uses when she's been half expecting something. She said, come in. She called to my father in the garage. She put the kettle on. He came in with grease on his hands from a project and wiped them on a rag and stood in the doorway between the garage and the kitchen. My mother set 3 mugs on the table and sat down across from me and folded her hands. She explained it with that specific gentleness she uses for things she's already decided. The estate would be organized to provide for her children and their children. Zoe would receive something. She was particular about this. She said Zoe will be included, but the primary distribution would flow through what she called the direct family line. I said, Zoe is his granddaughter. My mother said, of course, but there are practical considerations with the different households, what does that mean? It means the structure of the Mom. Say what you mean. She looked at me across the table. She has kind eyes. She has always had kind eyes, and she knows how to use them. She said, I think you already know what I mean, Rachel. There it was for the 3rd time. You know. You already know. She kept saying it as if the only thing left between us was my willingness to stop pretending. My father hadn't moved from the doorway. I looked at him. He was looking at the floor. I had spent 8 years finding reasons to believe he was different, warmer, that his silence was just his nature, not agreement, that if it ever became undeniable, he would step in. I had given him benefit of the doubt the way you give a loan to someone you trust, incrementally, over time, until the amount is more than you can afford to lose. He was looking at the floor. I said, Zoe asked me last week if you like her. He didn't say anything. I said, she asked me that. She's 8. My mother said, very softly, Rachel. I picked up my bag and stood up. I didn't say anything else. I didn't slam anything. I walked to the door, opened it, walked to my car, and drove away. I didn't cry on the drive home. I was past the place where this produced tears and into the place where it produced something colder and more useful. Zoe was at school. I had 4 hours. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought about the cameras. The venue was a family-run event space on the east side. Mismatched chairs, a parking lot that floods in heavy rain, the kind of place that books 60th birthdays and graduation dinners and retirements. I had helped Karen set up the afternoon before the party, and I remembered seeing the cameras. 2 mounted on the main hall ceiling, 1 at the entrance, 1 in the corridor near the bathrooms. I'd noticed them the way you notice things that don't matter yet. I called the manager the morning after I left my parents' house. I told him I was trying to review footage from an event 6 weeks prior, that my daughter had gotten locked outside briefly, and I was trying to understand what had happened. He was an older man, easy to talk to, the kind of person who runs a small business and doesn't look for reasons to make things complicated. He said he'd pull what he had. He sent 2 clips that evening by email. I waited until Zoe was asleep. I made a cup of tea I didn't drink, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the first clip. It was 47 seconds. Interior angle on the courtyard door. Timestamp 8:14 p.m. It showed Zoe walking through the door to the outside. The door settled behind her. 21 seconds later, Karen walked into frame from the direction of the dessert table. She looked through the glass. Not a glance. She looked, deliberately, for several seconds. Then she reached for the lock mechanism on the inside of the door, a lever you push down to engage the deadbolt, and she pushed it down. A deliberate motion, practiced. The kind you make when you know the mechanism, when you've thought about it. Then she walked away. I watched it 4 times. Each time I looked for something I'd missed, some reason it could be something other than what it was. There was nothing to find. It was 47 seconds, and it was exactly what it looked like. I opened the second clip. Main hall camera near the gift table. Timestamp 8:18 p.m., 4 minutes after the lock. My mother and her sister, my Aunt Patricia, standing near the table with plates of food. They were talking, their backs mostly to the camera, the audio compressed and partial. I turned my volume up. For the first 30 seconds, I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then the angle shifted slightly as one of them moved, and my mother's voice came through more clearly. She said, "She doesn't fit in the photos. She never has. Jim just doesn't see it yet." My aunt said something I couldn't make out. My mother said, "He will." The clip ran another 20 seconds on background noise and then ended. I closed the laptop. I sat there for a long time. He will. Present tense. Forward-facing. Not a regret. A trajectory. She wasn't describing a problem she was stuck with. She was describing something in motion, something she'd been tending, speaking to her sister the way you speak to someone who already knows the whole story and doesn't need it explained. Jim just doesn't see it yet. He will. I thought about the photo wall. I thought about the craft kit in its shrink wrap. I thought about 8 years of a box I'd been carrying and calling it something other than what it was. I thought about Zoe looking at her spoon and saying, "Okay," in the voice of a child who has already accepted an answer no one has given her. My mother had been managing this for years, carefully, patiently, the way you manage something you intend to finish, and she had assumed I already understood it. 3 separate times she had said, "You know you already know," because she believed I'd been watching and deciding not to see, the same way she'd been watching and deciding not to stop. She thought we were the same. I sat there for a long time with that. Then I opened my email. I sent both clips to my father's personal email address. Not to my mother, not to Karen, directly to him. The message was 1 line. "Watch these alone before we talk. I'll call Sunday." I sent it and didn't second guess it. He called Saturday morning at 9. I was in the kitchen. I let it ring once and answered. He said, "I watched them." I said, "Okay." A silence. He said, "I wasn't there when it happened. I want you to know that. I didn't know about the door." "I know you didn't." "But the other clip—" "I know, Dad." He went quiet. Something in the quality of the silence was different from the silence in his kitchen. He wasn't looking at the floor. He was somewhere else. He said, "How long has she been doing this?" It wasn't really a question. I said, "I don't know exactly. A long time." "Did you know?" I thought about that honestly before I answered. I knew something was wrong. I kept explaining it away. He said, "I did the same thing." Then, after a moment, "That's not an excuse." "No." We sat with it. Then he said, Tell me about Zoe. Actually tell me. What's she into right now? I hadn't expected that. I'd prepared for something harder. For defense, for deflection, for the careful management I'd gotten used to from everyone in that family. Not for that. I told him. The space phase. She'd been reading library books about the James Webb Telescope, carrying one around the house for 2 weeks. She'd been trying to memorize the planets in order and kept getting tripped up between Uranus and Neptune, which she found personally offensive. She liked the park with the creek. She took extraordinary pride in making her own lunches. She used her binoculars to look at clouds and narrate them. He listened. He asked real questions. Her teacher's name, whether she was happy at school, what Marcus was like with her. He asked about Marcus with the tone of someone asking about a person, not a variable. We talked for almost 2 hours. At some point he said, "I should have been paying attention a long time ago." I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm sorry, Rachel." I believed him. I also understood that sorry doesn't put years back, doesn't unask Zoe's question about the spoon, doesn't rehang the photo wall. I said I know, and I meant it. I meant 3 weeks after that call, his attorney reached out to my number, a revised estate document, Zoe's name in the primary distribution, the same percentage as any other grandchild, equal, not a token mention, equal. Karen called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 4 minutes long. I deleted it without listening. My mother didn't call for 11 weeks. My father called the following Sunday. He called the Sunday after that, too. I haven't shown Zoe the footage. She's 8. What's in that clip is not hers to carry yet. What I've told her is that things with Grandpa are different now, that he's been figuring some things out. She accepted that the way she accepts most things, without pushing, with the patient quiet she learned earlier than she should have. The first time my father came to our house on his own, it was a Sunday morning in March. He called from the driveway. He didn't presume to just knock. He said he'd been at a used bookshop downtown the day before and found something and thought of Zoe. It was an illustrated history of space exploration. Hardcover, the pages thick and the photographs large and dark. He'd remembered that I'd mentioned the planets. Zoe answered the door and looked at the book, and then at him. She said, "Is this for me?" He said yes. He didn't explain more than that. He didn't apologize or try to compress 8 years into a doorstep. He held out the book, and she took it and said thank you and carried it directly to the couch and opened it. He came inside. I made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table, and we didn't talk about any of it. The footage, the will, the door. We just sat there while Zoe read. Every few minutes she'd say something from the other room, a fact she'd found, a photograph she thought was unbelievable, and he'd answer her, and she'd go back to reading. We did that for an hour. Then he said he should get going, and I walked him to the door, and he drove away. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car turn at the end of the street. I don't know what my mother and Karen have made of all of it. They have a version of this story, I'm sure. Everyone does. A version where the door was an accident, where the will was practical, where I was the one who overreacted and burned the family down over something small. The camera doesn't care about the version. It just kept running. That's the thing about cameras, the thing my mother forgot when she stood at that gift table with her plate of food and said what she said to her sister. They don't care about intentions or context or what you thought you were doing. They don't record the version of yourself you've curated for people who love you. They just record what's there. Zoe is still learning the planets in order. She got Uranus and Neptune sorted out last week and announced it at dinner with the confidence of someone who has resolved a long-standing grievance. She still takes her binoculars to the park. She still looks for shapes and clouds, the ones that make you think of something right away. Those are the ones that are something. If you have to try, it's just a cloud.